An adult with a heavy gold armlet, a small child held against the hip. Two figures lying close, locked in what looks unmistakably like an embrace. Four people together beneath a staircase at the end. These are the most famous bodies in Pompeii, and for 150 years everyone read them the same way. A mother, two sisters, a family caught in the last seconds of a run for the harbor. Nobody questioned it, because there was nothing to question it with. No names survived, no inscriptions, only the shapes the ash had kept. Then someone reached the bones sealed inside the plaster. In 2024, those bones said otherwise. Not a mother, not sisters, not a family at all. And what they said instead was stranger than the story. Because the strangest part was never who these people were not. It was where they came from. Mount Vesuvius stands about 10 kilometers from Pompeii, and when it opened in the year 79 of the Common Era, it did not destroy the city all at once. It destroyed it in two stages, and the difference between them decided everything. The first stage was fall. A column of pumice and ash rose over the mountain and came back down as a rain of stone that lasted through the afternoon and into the night, drifting in the streets, loading the roofs until beams cracked and ceilings came in. It was terrifying, and it was slow, and it was survivable. Most of Pompeii survived it. The great majority of the city walked out during those hours, carrying what they could, and never came back. The second stage came before dawn. Pyroclastic currents, ground-hugging clouds of gas and ash, moving faster than a person can run, swept down off the mountain and over the walls. The people still inside were the ones who had stayed. Even the day is unsettled. The traditional date is the 24th of August, taken from a letter Pliny the Younger wrote to Tacitus roughly 2 decades after he watched it happen. But in 2018, excavators in Regio 5 found a line of charcoal on a wall that was being replastered, dated the 16th day before the calends of November, which is the 17th of October. Charcoal does not survive long on a wall. Massimo Ossana argued it must have been written shortly before the burial. Autumn fruit in the deposits and a coin of Titus struck no earlier than September point the same way. Those defending August note that the graffito carries no year. The question is open. What is not open, and what matters far more here, is how the people died. Not by suffocation, which is what the casts appear to show and what almost everyone assumed for a century. Work led by the volcanologist Giuseppe Mastrolorenzo, with Pierpaolo Petrone and colleagues, put the lethal surge at Pompeii at roughly 250 to 300 degrees Celsius. They tested it by heating bone in the laboratory and matching the color against bone recovered from the city. 10 kilometers further out, Pompeii sat at the edge of the current's reach. It was too weak to bring the buildings down. It left an ash layer about 3 centimeters deep. And it killed instantly, indoors and out, before anyone had time to draw the breath that would have choked them. That has a consequence that runs through everything which follows. The raised hands, the drawn-up limbs, the clenched fists, the postures that read as grief, or shielding, or love, are heat contraction in muscle and tendon. They are not gestures, they are chemistry. The first thing anyone sees in these bodies was never a decision. Then the ash did the rest of the work, and it did it by accident. The currents left a fine, damp deposit that packed hard around each body and set. Underneath it, over weeks and months, the soft tissue rotted and drained and vanished, and the bone dropped and shifted and settled loose inside the space it left. What remained in the ground was not a body. It was a hole in the shape of one, an outline of shoulders and a hollow where a face had been. Pockets left in the negative by the folds of a tunic, the sole of a sandal, the separate strands of hair. Everything about a person that presses against the earth, recorded perfectly, and nothing at all of the person. What the ash preserved was an absence, and an absence has no sex, and no age, and no mother, and no sister, and no family. It has one property only. It has a shape. And a shape can be read whichever way the person standing over it already expects to read it. Excavation at Pompeii had been running since 1748. For more than a century, the men digging through the deposit treated the hollows they hit the way they treated any other void in the ground, something to be broken through on the way to the next room. Giuseppe Fiorelli was the first to understand what he was standing on. In 1863, working as director of the excavations, he had liquid plaster poured into one of those cavities and left to set. Hours later, the hardened ash was chipped away from the outside, and what came out was a person, not a skeleton. A figure, with the fall of a garment across the shoulder and the position of the fingers and the shape of a mouth. It was a genuine intellectual leap, and it is worth stating plainly what the leap was. Fiorelli did not find a better way to recover bodies. He worked out that the empty space itself was the artifact, that the thing worth keeping was the part where nothing was, and that the ash had been holding a record nobody had thought to ask it for. The method has been used ever since. Something over 1,000 victims have been recovered from Pompeii across 2.5 centuries of digging. 104 of them have been cast. That ratio matters, and it comes back later. The casts are not the dead of Pompeii. They are a small, selected fraction of the dead of Pompeii, chosen by whoever happened to be holding the trowel. What they became was something else again. They were the only images of Roman dead that looked like people rather than remains, and they did something no ruin could do. A collapsed wall tells you a city ended. A cast tells you a person did. The casts traveled. They went into museum halls and exhibition catalogs and photographs and school textbooks, and they carried the labels the excavators had given them. The mother, the sisters, the faithful guardian, the pregnant woman, written on placards, repeated in guidebooks, absorbed by generations of visitors as fact. None of those names came from the ground. Not one of these people left an inscription. Not one of them is recorded by name in any surviving text. Every identity attached to every cast was supplied afterwards by an archaeologist or a restorer looking at a shape and deciding what the shape meant. And then, in 2015, someone looked inside. During the restoration of 86 damaged casts, a project led by the archaeologist Estelle Laser, working with colleagues at the archaeological park, put 26 of them through computed tomography or X-ray. The aim was modest: study the skeletons sealed in the plaster and test the old interpretations against the bone. What came back was not what anyone had expected. There were no complete skeletons. Not one. The casts had been considerably manipulated. Bones had frequently been removed before the plaster went in. Metal rods had been introduced to hold figures upright. Features had been enhanced or altered, with the styling varying from cast to cast in ways that track the aesthetic preferences of the decade each was made in. One example does the whole job. Among the most reproduced of all the casts is a figure long described as a pregnant woman, identified by the swell of the abdomen. The scan showed no evidence the individual was female, and the epiphyses of the radius and ulna appeared fused, indicating an adult. The distension was almost certainly clothing, bunched as the body fell. She had been a fixture of the story for over a century. She was only fabric, so the casts were never neutral records. They were sculptures, shaped by people who had already decided what they were sculpting, and every narrative Pompeii told about its dead had been resting on them the entire time. In 1974, excavators working in Regio 6, Insula 17, opened a house built down the slope toward the sea in terraces, one level above the next, using the old city wall as its foundation. Frescoed rooms, colored marble floors, a garden room painted on every wall. It had belonged to people with a great deal of money. At the foot of the staircase leading down toward the garden and the port, they found 3 bodies close together. 2 adults and a young child, the child apparently held against the hip of one of them. A few meters away along the corridor, a second child of about 4 years old. Scattered near them, more than 200 gold and silver coins. And on the arm of one adult was the object that gave the house its name. 610 grams of solid gold formed as two serpent heads facing one another, holding between their jaws a disc bearing the bust of Selene, the moon goddess, crowned by a crescent. The reading assembled itself, and it required almost no effort at all. Gold and a child on the hip meant a mother. The second adult meant a father. The child down the corridor meant a family broken apart in the last seconds of a run for the harbor, one of them separated in the passage while the others reached the stairs and got no further. Tommaso Rocco set it out that way in print, and the house became known for it. 4 people, 1 household, 1 death. 60 years earlier, in 1914, Vittorio Spinazzola's excavations in Reggio I, Insula 6, had produced something similar in a house named for the covered passageway running along 3 sides of its garden. 9 bodies were found in the garden itself. It was possible to cast 4 of them. 2 of those 4 lay close together, in a position that looked unmistakably like an embrace. Spinazzola described them as a group of fugitives buried in the ash, and the interpretations that followed proposed 2 sisters, or a mother and daughter, or lovers. All 3 readings share one assumption. Whatever bound these 2 people together, it was intimate, and it was chosen, and they held on to Etienne at the end. The later scanning work gave the reading its only physical support. One of the pair was estimated at 14 to 19 years old, and the other as a young adult. Osteological sex could not be determined for either, though the relative gracility of one skull was noted at the time. The third case sat outside the walls entirely, at the villa northwest of the town, where a 1st century fresco cycle of a rite associated with Bacchus survived almost intact. A man was found alone in a room, lying on top of a layer of ash. That detail carries more than it looks. Ash meant the second phase. He had lived through the whole of the falling pumice and died in the current that came before dawn. He was about 1.85 meters, thin, with a convex nasal bridge. On the little finger of his left hand was an iron ring, set with a carnelian, carved as a female figure. Beside him, 5 bronze coins and a whip. From the traces of his clothing and the modesty of his possessions, Amadeo Maiuri read him as low in status, and the interpretation that attached itself and stayed was the custodian of the villa who had faithfully remained at his post while the household fled. 3 houses, 3 stories, a mother, a pair of sisters, a loyal servant. And every one of them was assembled out of posture, jewelry, and proximity, because that was the entire evidence base available. What was needed was a record that could not be arranged by the person doing the digging. That record arrived on the 7th of November, 2024, in the journal Current Biology, in a paper titled Ancient DNA Challenges, Prevailing Interpretations of the Pompeii Plaster Casts. It was led by Elena Pilli and Stefania Vai as joint first authors, working with David Caramelli at the University of Florence, alongside Alyssa Mitnick and David Reich at Harvard, and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, with Valeria Amoretti, Gabriel Zuchtriegel, and Massimo Osana supplying the archaeological context from the park itself. The opportunity was an accident. The restoration of those 86 damaged casts meant that, for the first time, bone inside them could be reached without breaking anything that mattered. The sampling was smaller and plainer than the result suggests. 14 casts from 7 locations across the city. Bone fragments and teeth taken through parts already broken. The outer surface of each fragment stripped away with a rotary tool to remove modern contamination, then 45 minutes under ultraviolet light, then roughly 50 milligrams of powder. Mitochondrial capture in Florence. Screening at Harvard. 7 libraries survived the screening well enough to attempt enrichment for 1.24 million points across the genome. 5 made it through. It is worth being exact about what 5 means, because it is routinely overstated. These are not complete genomes. Coverage ran from 6/1000ths of a fold to just under half a fold, which is to say that most positions were read once or not at all. They are the thinnest readings the technique can work with, which makes what they agreed on harder to explain away, not easier. All 5 individuals were genetically male. Take the house with the bracelet first, because it is the one everybody knows. The team was able to sample all 4. The adult wearing 610 grams of gold with a small child held against the hip was male. The child was not related to him. The second adult, the presumed father, showed no maternal relationship to any of the others. The child found down the corridor was unrelated to all 3. There was no biological relatedness between any of the 4, to at least the 3rd degree. Not parents, not siblings, not cousins. Mitnick's summary of it was that all 4 were determined male, 3 of them from nuclear data and the 4th from the Y chromosome target in the quantification. The family in the House of the Golden Bracelet was 4 unrelated men and boys who happened to die within a few meters of one another. Then the embrace, and here the finding needs to be stated precisely, because it is very commonly reported wrong. Only one of the 2, individual 22, yielded usable nuclear data. That individual was male. The other, individual 21, gave a mitochondrial genome only, and it belonged to a completely different haplogroup, which rules out any relationship through the maternal line. So sisters is finished, mother and daughter is finished. But the sex of the second person remains unknown, and the honest position is to leave it there rather than supply a woman the data does not contain. What can be said is that whatever these 2 were to one another, they were not what a century of captions claimed. And the custodian at the villa, alone on his layer of ash with his ring and his coins and his whip, was confirmed male, which was the one thing about him nobody had ever doubted. Every relationship in those 3 houses had been inferred from where the bodies came to rest. Not one of them survived contact with the bone, which left a question the old stories had never needed to ask, because they had answered it before it could be raised. If these people were not families, then who were they? The answer came out of the same 5 genomes, and it had nothing to do with who was related to whom. When the team placed the 5 against a reference set of thousands of ancient and present-day individuals, they did not sit where a Roman town in Campania should sit. They fell away from modern Italians, away from Iron Age and late Iron Age populations of the Italian peninsula, away from the Etruscans of the same century who lived a few hundred kilometers up the coast. They clustered instead toward the eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, and North Africa. The modeling said the same thing in numbers. For every individual, the largest single component of ancestry traced to early farming populations of Anatolia or the Levant, running between 48 and 75%, depending on the person. The second largest, between 26 and 45%, came from sources related to Neolithic farmers of Iran. The Y chromosome lineages were J2A, J2B, E1B, and T1A, all of which first emerged in Western Asia. But the finding is not the average. The finding is that the 5 differ from each other. Individual 52, the man wearing the gold, produced by far the best genome of the group. He carries no detectable Anatolian farmer ancestry at all. He models as Levantine and Iranian, and when the team tested him against more recent populations, no simple model worked except those in which Egypt supplied the majority of his ancestry. Of everyone tested, he clusters closest to contemporaneous people of the Levant. From his genome, the team could predict black hair and dark skin. The man at the Villa of the Mysteries is his mirror image. Individual 25 is the only one of the 5 who requires a step component, an ancestry source none of the others need, pointing to European populations that did not contribute to anyone else in the sample. He is also the only one tested isotopically. His strontium and oxygen values fall inside the ranges of the southern Campanian plain and the central Italian coast, consistent with having grown up in or near Pompeii itself, locally raised, mixed ancestry, no contradiction between the two. One more measurement finishes the picture. Individual 52 was covered well enough to look for runs of homozygosity, the long identical stretches that appear when parents are related or when a population is small and closed. He had one, and it was short, 4.71 centimorgans. There is no sign of related parents. There is no sign of a small population. This is not an isolated result. The genetic study of Imperial Rome, led by Margaret Antonio in 2019, found the same Eastern Mediterranean shift in the capital, and the single Pompeian genome published in 2022 from the House of the Craftsman fits alongside them. Pompeii was a river port on a trade route. The genomes say it behaved like one, and the objects have been saying it too, from the opposite end of the city's class structure. In November 2025, during conservation of the street food counter in Regio 5, archaeologists documented a situla standing in the middle of the back kitchen. Green and yellow glass paste, decorated with hunting scenes in the Nilotic style, of a type produced in Alexandria. In the Vesuvian towns, objects like it turn up as ornaments in the gardens and reception rooms of the wealthy. This one had been repurposed as a kitchen bucket in a shop selling hot food to people who could not afford gardens. The attribution rests on style and material. Residue analysis is still to come. A luxury from Egypt, worn down into a working container behind a counter. And in a house across town, a man whose ancestors most plausibly came from Egypt, wearing 600 grams of gold. The catastrophe did not fall on a closed provincial town. It fell on a crossroads, and it caught it mid-traffic. Step back from the 5 genomes, and the pattern underneath them is not really about Pompeii at all. The casts recorded posture. Posture was read as relationship. 2 bodies close together became kin. Gold on an arm became a woman. An adult with a child against the hip became a parent. And 4 people who died within a few meters of one another became a household with a father at its head. None of that was carelessness. There was nothing else to work with. No names, no inscriptions, no bones anyone could sex reliably, and a body of evidence that had been reshaped by restorers for a century before the question was even asked. The interpretations filled a vacuum because a vacuum is intolerable, and a shape in the ground demands to be told what it is. What the study exposed is how automatic the filling was. Nobody stood over these casts and argued for a mother. They simply saw one. And the mother they saw was the one they had brought with them. That is the part worth carrying out of Pompeii, and it is worth being honest about its limits in the same breath. 5 individuals, out of 104 casts, out of more than 1,000 recovered victims, out of a town that held perhaps 20,000 people before the mountain opened. Genetic data from more than one person in a single house. Coverage thin enough that most of each genome was read once or not at all. The casts themselves are a compromised archive. Bones were removed before the plaster went in. Rods were inserted afterwards, and material was moved between and within them, which means bone recovered from inside a cast cannot always be assumed to belong to the body that cast depicts. Relatedness beyond the 3rd degree cannot be excluded from data this thin, and the sex of the second figure in the embrace is still unknown and may stay unknown. Then there is the limit that no amount of sequencing will move. A Roman household was not a bloodline. It contained enslaved people, freed people, dependents, wards, foster children, servants who had lived in the same rooms for decades. 4 unrelated males dying together at the foot of a staircase is entirely consistent with a household running for the harbour. DNA can rule out a bloodline. It cannot rule out a family. The correct conclusion is not that the old stories were replaced with true ones. It is that they were replaced with narrower ones, and that the space left over is honest emptiness rather than a better guess. The work continues under a framework built for exactly this. Gabriel Zuchtriegel, the park's director, has stated that no restoration or sampling proceeds without joint approval from scientific and heritage authorities, and that ancient DNA analysis has been part of standing study protocols for years, applied to animal remains as well as human ones. 86 casts have now been stabilized under those rules, and the city keeps producing things nobody predicted. In February 2025, excavators in Regio 9 opened a banqueting room in a house now called the House of the Theosis and found a frieze of near life-size figures running across 3 walls, a procession of the followers of Dionysus, painted in the 40s or 30s before the Common Era. It was already more than a century old when the ash arrived. Only one comparable painting is known, in the Villa of the Mysteries. 2 months later, outside the Porta Sarno gate, a team led by Lawrence Alapont recovered a funerary relief of a man and a woman carved almost at life size. Her jewelry and her attributes identify her as a priestess of Ceres, one of the most powerful religious offices a woman in this city could hold. There is no inscription, 2,000 years of carved evidence for exactly what she was, and not one word for who. Return to the 3 of them. The adult with 610 grams of gold on the arm, a small child held against the hip. 2 figures lying close, locked in what still looks like an embrace, 4 people together beneath a staircase. Nothing about them has changed. The plaster sits where Fiorelli's method left it. The hands are still raised. The child is still on the hip. What changed is what we are permitted to say. Not a mother, not sisters, not a family, at least not one written in blood. The ash never kept the story. It kept the shape, and we supplied everything else for 150 years, and only noticed when something sealed underneath the plaster was finally able to answer back. Roughly a third of Pompeii has never been dug. Whatever it is holding it in the same way.